and we're very excited to welcome you all here to our special presentation about the revival of the Nanticoke language. Um, Dr. Keith Cunningham will be addressing you shortly. Um, so we see people are coming from different places, and William Jackson from Delaware. It's another place where the Nanticoke resided or currently reside. Welcome. We have some Timo from Washington, D.C. Um, you're welcome to turn on your cameras if you wish, or you can remain uh, with your camera off. That's just up to you, of course. We want to make sure we have plenty of time for our speaker to give his excellent presentation. So I'm going to give you a brief introduction to the National Museum of Language, especially we have a lot of people signed in today who may have not ever been to one of our presentations, so we're very happy you're here. Shanina, I think you're new. I remember seeing you at a previous one. Great. So the National Museum of Language is a fully virtual museum. We don't have a building. I think that makes us unique in the United States, and especially unique as a language museum. But we've actually been in operation for over 25 years. We started up in 1997, and we had a building for a few years, but that wasn't feasible for us to continue to have a building. It's quite expensive, and that was a little bit before the pandemic. And so around 2013, we switched to being partly virtual. And so when the pandemic hit in 2020, we were really ahead of the curve on doing things virtually. And so we just switched everything to virtual. So our exhibits are available on our website, which is open 24/7. It's free. We have a lot of different exhibits. Um, and we do these presentations. And we've discovered that being virtual has advantages. We can reach people from around the world much more easily than we could just when we had a small in-person museum in Maryland near the University of Maryland that we did for about 5 years. So, again, a very warm welcome to all our guests here today, and hope that you'll have a chance to check out our website after the program. We are an independent museum. We're not affiliated with the university. We're not government supported. We do occasionally get grants that come from a state government or a national government, and we get donations from people who like to support us, but we don't have a formal affiliation with any large organization. So that gives us a lot of freedom to present the kind of things that we want to present. So again, welcome here today. And just want to mention a couple of people here who are officers of the museum. Um, Jill Robbins is our vice president. Fareed Sadie is Dr. Fareed Sadie is a trustee of the museum on our board of trustees. Greg Nedved will be introducing our speaker. Is the most recent past president. He was president for 5 years, and I've taken over as president a little over a year ago. So I'm going to stop taking up your valuable time with that. And again, you can check out our website at your convenience. There's a self-guided tour that you can take of the website that's on the landing page. You can link into that, and it'll show you around some of our exhibits. So I'm going to hand this over to Emily Murray. She's the executive assistant. She's going to give you a little bit more information about what's going to happen today. Over to you, Emily.
Great, thank you. Yeah, so again, I will not take up very much of your time, but just wanted to advise about a few of the mechanics for today's program. So our program is scheduled to run until about 4 o'clock p.m. Eastern time, so about 2 hours total. I'm going to hand things over to Greg Nedved, who Dr. Murray just mentioned, to introduce our speaker in a moment. And then he's going to present the first half of the program for about 40 to 45 minutes. Then we'll take about a 5-minute break, and then he'll resume and provide the rest of his presentation. If you have any questions or comments that arise while he's presenting, please do drop them into the meeting chat. I and others will be monitoring that. In terms of asking specific questions, again, please feel free to drop that into the chat. Keith may take some of those as we go, or may save them for either the break or the end of the program. But definitely, we want to hear from you, and we will have a bit of time at the end to have the Q&A and discussion. So please let us know what you think, or if you want any clarifications or have further information about anything we're presenting on. So we do ask that everyone stay muted if you're not speaking, to avoid any background noise, but otherwise feel free to be on or off camera, whatever you're most comfortable with. And with that, I will turn it over to Greg to introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Emily. I hope everyone can hear me. And again, I won't be long. We don't want to cut into Keith's time. I'm Greg Nedved. As Laura said, I'm the former president of the museum. And now I'm, among other things, I'm the speaker chair. And I'm delighted to introduce Keith. Keith is actually somebody that I knew before, at least as far as I know, before he was ever involved with Nanticoke. As you're about to discover, Keith has a number of languages that he knows, and one of them is Chinese. And when he first learned Chinese, at least I think it was the first time he learned Chinese, I was a program manager. Obviously, he's gone on to bigger and better things since then. He's a real expert on Nanticoke. He just got his doctorate from Georgetown University, which is impressive in itself. I'm not going to say anything else again. I don't want to cut into his time, but we're absolutely delighted to have Keith here today. It's a real honor for us because we really believe in language preservation at the National Museum of Language. Okay, Keith, batter up.
So, hello everyone, welcome. I'm honored to be here today to speak about my work with the Nanticoke tribe to revitalize our language. And I would like to start by acknowledging that this presentation today is coming to you from Piscataway land. And the Piscataway are the indigenous inhabitants of southern Maryland, where they still reside today as part of 3 state-recognized groups. And I thank the Piscataway for their stewardship of the land, as well as their continued contributions to our society today. I'm also honored to see a number of people from the Nanticoke tribe in the audience. Thank you. Thank you. And thank you, friends, for joining, everyone. I really appreciate you taking the time to hear my presentation today. And I'm going to present my screen now. And so, my presentation today is called The Nanticoke Revival, From Whispers of the Past to Voices of the Future. Going to be speaking about how I've used some of the archival documentation of Nanticoke to help bring it back as a fully functional language for the Nanticoke community, which continues to reside in their homelands today. A little bit more about my personal background. I first became fascinated with languages in high school when I started studying Japanese. Admittedly, I'd studied French a bit before in middle school, but for me, it was encountering Japanese, which is so different from English, that kind of opened up a different perspective for me. I got to see another worldview, and that really kind of guided the course of my life from there, to try just viewing language as one of the best lenses into which you can really understand another culture. And so since then, I've acquired a couple more languages. In my undergraduate days, I started studying Mandarin Chinese as well. I found the Chinese characters as they were used in Japanese very fascinating, and that naturally led to my interest in Chinese. During my time at Georgetown, I did some field work in the Apsaloka language, which is a Siouan language. And I've studied a number of other languages, but recently I've been doing, in the past few years, I've been focusing heavily on the Algonquian family, including Ojibwe, Unami Delaware, and of course Nanticoke. So I just fairly recently. I finished my PhD dissertation entitled A Phonological Analysis of Nanticoke with Practical Applications for Language Revitalization. And that, among other things, that'll be the focus of my talk today, of how, how it is that I use these archival documents to help reconstruct the language as it was spoken. So, language revitalization, that is, it's an attempt to halt or reverse the decline of a language or to revive an extinct one. And to date, the most successful example of that is the revival of Hebrew as the national language of Israel after well over a millennium of not being a spoken language. But at least since the 1990s, there have been efforts among American Indian tribes to revitalize their languages as well. And this image that I have over on the right here is a page from John Eliot's Bible in the Massachusetts language. And so for the early missionaries, they reasoned that it would be easier to translate all of the scriptures into the indigenous language rather than first teaching all of the indigenous people English and then converting them with English materials. And this actually, this along with a lot of writings by native authors, because this decision that they made to translate the Bible into the Massachusetts language established it as a written language in the community. And so even though they had been bereft of a native speaker for well over 150 years, Jesse Little Doe Baird, a member of the Wampanoag tribe, was able to reconstruct the language using these copious documents that were left behind by missionaries as well as native authors. And this was really the inspiration for my own work. This is documented. It's a wonderful film by Anne Makepeace called We Still Live Here, which tells the story of the Wampanoag revitalization. So this the Algic languages, it's the most geographically it's the most widespread of all of these American Indian languages and what's now the United States and very significant portion of Canada as well. And it actually includes all of the Algonquian languages. And then way over in California, in Humboldt County, you have Wiyot and Yurok, which are sister languages to the wider Algonquian family. Interestingly enough, Wiyot and Yurok are no more closely related to one another than they are to the Algonquian languages. So there must have been some movement there, and then they ended up later coming together at the same place there. But this distribution kind of hints at the Orheimat, that is the original place where the hypothesized place where the proto-language from which all of these languages descended was spoken, sought to be in the Columbia Plateau, like what's now Washington State, Idaho. And that was it's estimated about 7,000 years before present. Paul Proul suggested that there was a drought event around that time that triggered the migrations. The Algonquian peoples moved eastward, and they were part of Western Idaho burial complex. It's thought that those archaeological remains are representative of Proto-Algonquian peoples. And they moved out. The first group to split off, you have the Plains Algonquian languages. Blackfoot is thought to be the first one that split off because it represents the greatest divergence phonologically from the rest of the family. And then you have the other Plains Algonquian languages, such as Arapaho and Cheyenne. And then after they split off, the Algonquian groups moved to the Midwest, where they were part of the Hopewell Exchange, which was formerly referred to as the Hopewell culture, but there were actually a lot of different cultures interacting there, trading goods with one another. And Hopewell, that's roughly about like the 2nd century BC is where that begins. And still in the Midwest and in Canada, you have languages such as Ojibwe, Menominee, Cree, and Shawnee. And the Shawnee even had a presence in Maryland for a time. And then there is the Eastern Algonquian subgroup. And Eastern Algonquian represents the one sort of trenchant division within the family where it appears that there was an intermediate ancestor to all of these languages. And the languages, they range everywhere from Mi'kmaq up in Nova Scotia and Maine. You have Abenaki languages such as Passamaquoddy, Penobscot in Maine as well. The Southern New England Algonquian languages such as Massachusetts, the Delawarean languages, Mohican, and then going all the way down to coastal North Carolina, you have the basically every instance where you had the English were first encountering indigenous peoples, it was with Eastern Algonquian speakers. And this group, it constitutes a dialect line of sorts, where each language has similarities with its neighbors, so that it was very easy for a person who knew one language to acquire the language of their neighbors. And there are also traits that are shared by all and only these Eastern Algonquian languages, such as the restructuring of the vowel system, the 8-vowel system of Proto-Algonquian, simplified to the 6-vowel system of Proto-Eastern Algonquian. In addition, there are a lot of words that are shared only by the Eastern languages. They aren't found elsewhere in the family. Nanticoke exhibits a lot of these. The word for fire, like tunt, is you find that down in Carolina Algonquian and Tunte and Lenape, etc. And so these indicate that there was kind of this intermediate group between Proto-Algonquian and the descendant languages, where these languages all share a much greater affinity for one another. And from a revitalization standpoint, that is fortunate because we can appeal to these neighboring languages when we're filling in the gaps in documentation. So I know this is kind of a busy slide here, so I'm going to summarize for you. But fortunately, we do have some attestation of the oral history of the Nanticoke people, so we can learn their origin story. And so this picture over on the left here is Reverend John Heckewelder. He was a Moravian missionary. The Moravian Church converted a lot of indigenous people to Lenape. There was a contingent of Lenape, and then as many Nanticoke left their homelands, they joined this Lenape group and also became part of the Moravian Church. And Reverend Heckewelder recorded an oral history from Chief Robert White of the Nanticoke. And Chief Robert White began by saying that the Nanticoke originally were of the same stock as Lenape people. To Algonquian peoples, the Lenape are called grandfathers. They're given a place of respect in ceremonies, and they're acknowledged as the originating group from which the other Algonquian peoples descended. And so Chief White said that at some point the Nanticoke migrated to the eastern seaboard, and then they adapted to fishing and trapping along the rivers, and then later they were joined by a group of Lenape as they migrated eastward. And this combined group of Lenape and Nanticoke, they established the Piscataway. And archaeological evidence, it says that this kind of joint Lenape coastal Algonquian group made it all the way down, was part of was the group that established the Algonquian presence in North Carolina. So, going to the archaeological evidence, there is a wonderful Wayne Clark wrote a really wonderful synthesis of the archaeological evidence for the migration of Algonquian peoples into the Susquehanna and the Delaware River areas. He included, so it was archaeological evidence combined with linguistic evidence, just a real tour de force where he mapped out the history of the Algonquian peoples as they moved into the region. And so Wayne Clark said that the Meadowwood Archaeological Complex, which that starts in upstate New York, and is characterized by artifacts such as the Vignette 1 phase ceramics. That picture on the right there, that's a Vignette 1 vessel there. That's a grit tempered ware. And use of Onondaga chert and stone tools. And they established a presence down in Delmarva as well. And so Wayne Clark hypothesized that the original inhabitants were probably maybe Proto-Siouan speakers. There are still, and we think of Siouan as a language family mostly in the Great Plains, but we have Tutelo, Saponi in Virginia, North Carolina, and Catawba is also thought to be part of that same language family. And in the archaeological record, we see that what was originally soapstone vessels, as used by the previous inhabitants, were gradually replaced by the ceramic vessels brought by these Algonquian migrants. And it looks like the Algonquian migrants kind of they traded with the Siouan peoples and intermarried with them. It wasn't a displacement. It was gradually just the Algonquian culture was adopted by the people who were already there as well. And so we see during the middle and late woodland periods, the Jacks Reef Horizon Complex, which Wayne Clark says represents this movement of the Delaware people to the eastern seaboard. And then they moved further southward to the Chesapeake between 1100 and 13 AD. And this is represented by the Potomac Creek complex. And that includes things like the Mockley ceramics, which is a shell-tempered ware that is found quite frequently in archaeological sites in Maryland. And then when you get to the historic period, you'll see that the Nanticoke sites will have a mixture of the more coastal Algonquian forms, and then these introduced, and then some Lenape style artifacts representing this kind of cultural mixture that occurred when they were reunited with their Lenape kin. So, at the time of contact, and this can see this is you had three different language families represented here in Maryland. The ones highlighted in green there, such as Susquehannock, Tuscarora, and Tuscarora were originally down in North Carolina. That represents Iroquoian languages. And then the ones that are highlighted red there, those are the Algonquian languages. And then you see Saponi and Tutelo down there. They migrated from further southward. They spoke they speak a Siouan language. And so again, Nanticoke is part of this Eastern Algonquian subgroup within the wider Algonquian family. And it's grouped together with Piscataway as like a Maryland Algonquian subgroup. And so Nanticoke is the eastern side of this dialect line is represented in three 18th century vocabularies, which I'll delve into in a bit. So one thing about the term Nanticoke originally specifically referred only to the group that lived by the river of the same name. Later, as Maryland tribes were confined to reservations, you would have many groups would be living together on the reservation, and then Nanticoke kind of became more of a catch-all term for the Eastern Algonquian peoples in Maryland. But you had other groups such as Pocomoke, Choptank, etc., which were politically their own groups. But then in the historic period, gradually just came to be referred to as Nanticoke. But the Nanticoke first contact with the English was when John Smith was surveying the Chesapeake Bay. And on June 8th, 1608, he encountered the Nanticoke at their palisaded town of Cuscarawok. And this name here, William Wallace Tooker, analyzed it as meaning they can make white shell beads. The Nanticoke make beads from the channel whelk, and they were also known as the best fur traders in the region. But those white beads are extremely important, and they would trade them with people all throughout the East Coast. And at first sight of the English, the Nanticoke greeted him with a hail of arrows. And so John Smith and crew, they retreated, dropped anchor away from the shore, and stayed overnight. Next day they approached and they found that the inhabitants were beckoning them ashore, and they brought baskets. They also saw some people hiding in the marshes, and they got suspicious. So then John Smith and the English crew greeted them with a hail of gunfire, and they retreated. they went ashore and they found that the baskets were filled with various trade goods. And so after those two very unfriendly encounters, John Smith encountered some fishermen who were returning home and weren't present for all of the hostilities. And he convinced them that he meant them no harm. And so he went ashore, and then, that he, befriended these inhabitants of Cuscarawok. So, the subsequent history of contact is unfortunately, fraught with, there was an outright war with Nanticoke in 1642, as well as just a continual settler encroachment upon their lands. A lot of treaties just went ignored. And then also there was this, there's lack of understanding of how, or maybe outright taking advantage of how the indigenous people what their relationship with the land was. They would have migration sometimes, and they would go on a seasonal migration somewhere, come back to their land to find that there are English houses built upon it. There wasn't this idea that somebody would just purchase this parcel of land and have some sort of permanent dominion over it. And this continued for a while until the real watershed moment was the Winnesaukam incident in 1742. There was a Shawnee chief named Messawan who had recently been evicted from his land by the English, and he was starting stirring up war with trying to enlist a number of different tribes to push the English out of the land once and for all. So the plot at Winnesaukam, the part that the Eastern Shore people were to play in that was that they were going to poison all of the wells of the English colonists and weaken them in advance of a three-pronged attack that would come from the north from other tribes. And so interestingly, the Nanticoke and tribes of the Eastern Shore were known for their mastery of using poisons. And it was said that a Nanticoke poison master could, with just a handful of dust, could blown at an opposing army, they would all fall down. So unfortunately for them, the Maryland government caught on to what was going on. They thought it strange that all of the native inhabitants had disappeared. Usually, if they go out on hunting expeditions, somebody would remain behind. But all of their indigenous peoples just disappeared at once, and they followed the trail of evidence and found this gathering at Winnesaukam. And they started questioning people and got some inconsistent stories. One person claimed that this big cauldron they were cooking up was a cough medicine because he was not feeling well. Eventually, somebody confessed confessed the plot, and then after that, the English abolished their treaty relationship with the Assateague Emperor. They abolished the title altogether, and they sold off a good number of lands, and they've passed some increasingly restrictive laws. For instance, not allowing trading of even glass bottles to indigenous peoples, because you can knock off the bottom of a glass bottle, nap it into an arrowhead. So a lot that understandably, a lot of the indigenous people found it impossible to live under these new conditions with all the restrictions on movement and dwindling portions of land. And over the ensuing decades, they petitioned the Maryland government to leave the colony. Some went northward with the Haudenosaunee, who were their traditional enemies. A lot of them were adopted by the Cayuga tribe, and they were even given two of their chief positions at their tribal council. And others, they joined the Lenape, and they followed their migrations, some ending up in Oklahoma, others also in Canada. And then by the time that the founding of the U.S., there were just a very few reservation lands left, and part of the foundation. So Washington D.C. was kind of carved out of Maryland and Virginia land, but there was also a monetary contribution as part of that arrangement. And in order to pay for its part of that deal, Maryland sold off the remaining reservation lands to pay for the establishment of Washington D.C. And that includes the Indian River Reservation, which at the time was part of Maryland. and the Indian River Reservation being where the modern day Nanticoke, where that was their reservation originally. And then the language itself, the last known speaker of it was Lydia Clark, who passed away in 1859. And reports from Frank Speck, who went up to the Nanticoke in Canada, seem to indicate that the language went dormant around the same time. So Frank Speck, he was a student of Franz Boas, whereas a lot of Franz Boas students, they would go out west if they wanted to study indigenous cultures. The thinking at the time was that everyone who remained on the East Coast was so thoroughly assimilated that there would be nothing really left to study. And Frank Speck proved that was very wrong. Every group that he studied on the Eastern Seaboard, he was able to establish the continuity of traditions among a lot of these groups that remained in their homelands. But the Nanticoke, they first were recognized as a tribe by the state of Delaware in 1881. Frank Speck, he traveled to the community, befriended Russell Clark, who later became Chief Winnebago, who you see on the right there. And Speck documented a lot of survivals of Nanticoke traditions. And this was right before, before like factory farming and everything. They still would practice a lot of the traditional agricultural practices. Like they had their traditional pestles and mortars for making hominy. They would grow the Three Sisters and the companion planting system that their ancestors had used for generations. And all of this clear evidence that indeed the Nanticoke people were still very much in their homelands and still continuing to practice their culture. And so, with Frank Speck's help, the tribe incorporated in 1921, and he also he helped them establish an annual powwow, which and you'll notice that especially with Chief Winnebago's regalia there, you'll notice a lot of characteristic of the Great Plains, this kind of thing. This was sort of the beginnings of the intertribal kind of pan-Indian culture that emerged in the 20th century, where powwow regalia is very much based on the Plains culture. In recent years, there have been a lot of reintroductions of more Eastern woodland style regalia. And this, the powwow that they started that continued until World War II, and there was it was then resumed in the 70s and continues to this day. And so then with the growing interest in language revitalization, the Nanticoke wanted to join this renaissance of language, and it was around just the early 21st century when that began. And so I mentioned that the last native speakers of Nanticoke had passed away in the 19th century. Fortunately, we do have records to work from, and the primary sources we have are one by William Vansmurray, representative to the House from Maryland, who recorded a vocabulary of Choptank that comprises 348 words, and President Thomas Jefferson. He was an avid language enthusiast, and he gathered 77 words. And also it was at Thomas Jefferson's behest that William Vansmurray gathered the word list that he compiled. And then from Reverend Heckewelder, who I mentioned earlier, the Moravian missionary, he recorded 146 words. And he called his informant Samuel White, and I think that he's really conflating two different people. So I mentioned Chief Robert White, who imparted that oral tradition of the Nanticoke migration to Reverend Heckewelder. And there was also a Samuel Nanticoke, who was the chapel interpreter. And I suspect it was actually Samuel Nanticoke. He was known to be fluent in both Ojibwe and Nanticoke, as well as other languages that were spoken by the congregants at the Moravian mission. And then I proceed to salvage vocabulary with two asterisks here. When Frank Speck went up to visit the Nanticoke at the Six Nations in Canada, he recorded a vocabulary from the clan mother Emily Carrier and the chief Josiah Hill but most of this turns out not to be really Nanticoke. The numerals mostly are, as well as a couple other words, but there's clear admixture from Muncie, Delaware, as well as some Haudenosaunee influence in there, as would be expected as the Nanticoke migrated and interacted heavily with other groups. And aside from that, there's some scant mentions in other sources. There was, for instance, a Muncie informant to Frank Siebert, Nicodemus Peters, and in Frank Siebert's field notes, and there are some cursory notes about where Nicodemus Peters remembered from a childhood friend who was Nanticoke a couple words and phrases that he taught him. A lot of it really looks like Mission, Delaware to me. So it actually probably isn't really Nanticoke for the most part. So a little bit more detail on this first source here. So William Vance Murray, he was representative the House of Representatives from Maryland. He was a lawyer, a diplomat, and Thomas Jefferson gave him this blank word sheet and asked him to go to the Choptank Reservation, which is what's now Cambridge, Maryland. At the time, there were only about 9 individuals remaining there in 1792, most of whom dwelled in the traditional wigwams. And but then Queen Mulberry, her Choptank, her name being Winningelminsk, lived in an English-style frame house. And interestingly, he noted that they still, so it was common practice among the southeastern Algonquian peoples to preserve important individuals in Kyokusin houses. Murray noted that the body of Chief Winnikako was still preserved in a traditional Kyokusin house at that, not far from there. And so Murray recorded about 348 words. In addition to the words that Thomas Jefferson provided on his sheet, he thought of some of his own words that he elicited from Queen Mulberry. And this represents our most extensive source. And it represents kind of an idiosyncratic mix of English and French. Murray, being a diplomat, was fluent in French. So when he's recording this unfamiliar language, he's appealing to the languages with which he's familiar. And quill pen writing in general is just very difficult to interpret. For instance, the letter U or N can be hard to distinguish. Sometimes it's very faint crossbar on T. It can be easily mistaken for an L, etc. And then we have the Jefferson word list. And so this is a comparative table of American Indian languages. Jefferson's goal was to compile evidence of all of the languages that were still spoken at the time. And he wanted to assess how many distinct language families there were. And so in his comparative table, he had a row for Nanticoke wherein he recorded the entries from Murray's list, but then wrote in 77 instances, he wrote some words that he supplemented from another source. And it's in a Moravian German orthography. David Pentland, who did his dissertation on Nanticoke historical phonology, said it might have been another now lost Heckewelder word source, but the orthography looks a little different to me. We can't say for sure that it was from one of Heckewelder's word lists. But so I mentioned here that the manuscript was badly water damaged. This was a very unfortunate incident that occurred when Thomas Jefferson was returning home from his presidency. He shipped his belongings along the James River, and thieves ransacked them. Anything they deemed to not be of any monetary value, they took and they threw overboard. And this unfortunately included his manuscripts. And anything that floated ashore, he donated to the American Philosophical Society in Philadelphia, where they reside today. And but being that they were in the river, there's a lot of water damage. Some of the column headers are missing. So you have to determine from context what the definition of the word is. There are various lacunae in the manuscript where the water dissolved the paper. And they have them on map. I actually got to examine them in person, which was really surreal, to be able to kind of hold something that Thomas Jefferson wrote. And then we have the Heckewelder word list. So this was recorded in Upper Canada. Ontario, as now known, and elicited from Chief Samuel White. Again, may have been Samuel Nanticoke actually, but we don't have the original of it, unfortunately. But what we do have is we have two copies in Heckewelder's own hand, and then there's this a book by Stephen Duponceau. In which he transcribed the Heckewelder manuscript as well, and understandably, since that was the Nanticoke were part of the Moravian mission, then it has a mixture of some Mission Delaware and also Ojibwe were part of the Moravian church as well. And then a little bit more detail about the Speck salvage vocabulary. So it's collected from these two individuals that Speck visited on the Six Nations Reserve in 1914. Numerals, with the exception of the number 6, are probably Nanticoke. You have a mix. Some things are very clearly Munsee, like there was, he recorded the phrase "come here" from Emily Carrier as "you have," which is very clearly from Munsee, and also some Haudenosaunee vocabulary, which makes sense given that they were part of the Six Nations. So, really, the first serious scholarly research that occurred that was done on the language was over 100 years after the manuscripts were recorded. We have in 1893 Daniel Garrison Brenton did his own transcription of Murray's Choptank manuscript and supplied it, excuse me, and he supplied some cognate words from other Algonquian languages to demonstrate its affinities. And on the right here, we can see this, the Evolution Publications. They have the American Language Reprint Series, and their first volume was this, is a reprint of Brenton's treatment of the Choptank manuscript. And, we can thank him for gathering a lot of cognates together. Unfortunately, he was not a very careful copyist. He missed some words, misspelled others, but you're not bad as a first attempt on studying the language. And 1927, Frank Speck published his work on the Nanticoke community. And in addition to his own salvage vocabulary, he went back and did his own transcription of the 18th century sources. And so again, we can thank Frank Speck for doing this transcription. That was a lot of work. Unfortunately, he also missed a couple words here and there, which I'll get into detail a little bit later. And then mentions of Nanticoke, if any, in scholarly works are mostly kind of footnotes until you get to 1979, when Dr. David Pentland did his dissertation on Algonquian historical phonology, and the whole 6th chapter was Nanticoke. And since then there have been some other etymologies, mentioned kind of in passing in other works, for instance, like works on Southern New England Algonquian, noting the similarities. So, as I mentioned in beginning in the first decade of the 21st century, the Nanticoke were interested in revitalizing their language. And so Marilyn Ranville is an Anishinaabe woman who comes from the Sagking First Nation. And so, Ojibwe is related to Nanticoke. And the community wanted for a native speaker of a related language to come back and kind of interpret these sources and try to reconstruct the language. And so Ms. Ranville created, and one really, what's really impressive about Ms. Ranville is that she also had a knowledge of linguistics, or she has a knowledge of linguistics as well. And she was friends with the late Dr. Blair Roods. And in her work, reconstruction work, she appeals to work that he did for Virginia Algonquian in interpreting how, what the etymologies of the Nanticoke words were. And so she created a series of introductory lessons. She would reconstruct the Nanticoke words and kind of fill in the blanks with Ojibwe, and kind of an analogy to what is, it's kind of like, say, for instance, if you had a word list of French and you were to fill in the blanks with Spanish, clearly related, but different languages. And so Miss Ranville had another series of lessons in 2008, and along with a lot more cognates that she identified. And she left some instructions for subsequent work on the language, and she said that they needed a linguist to try to work out, try to go back, appeal to cognates and to the proto language to figure out, what the Nanticoke morphology was like. Basically reconstructing that instead of just, kind of filling in the gaps with a related language. And over on the right here, I have a picture of Marlene Randall's book, Text, a children's book, and incorporates a lot of Ojibwe words in it. So Miss Randall is an established language revitalization expert, doing a lot of work on her own Anishinaabe Moine as well. So it was, my interaction with the Nanticoke community began back in 2012. And this was after I had seen that documentary, We Still Live Here, about the Wampanoag language. I was visiting my aunt and uncle who live in Delaware, and I suggested we go to the Nanticoke Indian Museum because I was interested to see what efforts were going on within Maryland's tribes to see if they were doing some similar things as the Wampanoag. So I met the Sterling Street, who was the curator then. He retired in the past year, but still very active in community events and everything. And I just inquired about what was going on with regards to the language there, and he provided me. He mentioned that Miss Randall had taught classes the previous decade, and he handed me a photocopy of the Chop Tank vocabulary as interpreted by Brinton. And I just kind of got to work right there, kind of identifying cognates from what I had already learned from Wampanoag. And I did this independently for a while. But then eventually I realized that, while I had taken a linguistics class before, namely one in medieval Chinese phonology, I was going to need to professionalize in order to do this kind of work correctly. And so I enrolled in Georgetown in 2015. First, I was working with Dr. Mark Sicoli, and that's where I really got serious about linguistics, and my goal, and already then I had my intention for my dissertation was to do a full treatment of the word lists and reconstruct the language. And from that point, we had a lot more kind of formal language revitalization things. We had in 2017, I hosted a series of classes at the Nanticoke Indian Center. This was, a series of introductory classes, kind of, geared towards all age groups. We had they were pretty well attended. Admittedly, then I didn't really have much background in language pedagogy. So some of it was kind of tantamount to like a linguistics data dump of sorts, where I think I might have bewildered some people by using so much grammatical terminology and the like. So in subsequent works, I've really focused on refining that and trying to present the material in a way that isn't, it's more as a living language rather than kind of taxidermy and making people memorize all these different grammatical terms in addition to the words themselves. That culminated in some YouTube lessons that I made on the Nanticoke language, where I kind of stripped down all the linguistic-y kind of grammar terminology and tried to present it in an engaging way. And I went into some things like family terms, using introductory lessons on like color terms, which is also served as an introduction to like animate versus inanimate. That's an important distinction in Algonquian languages, and so forth. And then in 2021, I worked with tribal members to create a full-fledged textbook, and I'll get into a lot more detail about that later. Excuse me. So my dissertation was entitled Phonological Analysis of Nanticoke with Practical Applications for Language Revitalization. And I went into it with a series of questions that I was trying to answer. And so I had, as I mentioned before, there was already one treatment of the work by Dr. David Pentland in 1979. At that time, he was positing a direct descent from Proto-Algonquian. So I wanted to determine whether the evidence points to Nanticoke being descended from Proto-Algonquian, or if it was part of this Proto-Eastern Algonquian subgroup proposed by Ives Goddard. And also, since there were a lot of groups that coalesced on these reservations, there's some clear dialect mixture in the remaining recordings of the language. So part of the puzzle was seeing how many dialects were represented there, as represented as demonstrated by the phonology that I could ascertain from these word lists. And then finally, once I worked out the phonology, I went about formulating a strategy for filling in the blanks in the documentation, and with the goal of making some practical materials for the community to revitalize their language. And so that's the premise of my dissertation. I think now would be a good time to take a short break, and I'll get into the I'll get into the details after we've had a time to regroup. Okay, so for the break, I introduced the premise of my dissertation. Now I'm going to get into the details of it. So the first thing I did was do a fresh transcription of the original sources. And as I mentioned before, in the Brenton and Speck, very good treatments of the language in general, but there were some words that were missed, as well as some misspellings and all. And also at the advice of Ives Goddard, he said, it's best practice to consult the original manuscript. Citing more recent compilations isn't really good practice for philology. So I took his advice, and I looked at the original manuscripts and did my own copy of them. And that alone, it eliminated a lot of the perception that there was a lot of divergence between the word lists. It looks like the dialect, well, there's some clear dialect mixture. The vocabulary is quite similar across them. And I'll show you that in more detail as I get into the specifics for each of the lists. So after I did the transcription, I gathered the proto-language etymologies. At the time, there were 2 Proto-Algonquian dictionaries, one computer-generated, interestingly enough, by Dr. John Hewson, another older, more traditional one from the 1970s as well. And then I gathered cognates from the sister languages to kind of smooth it, some instances where there was some ambiguity there. Looking at cognates could, for instance, help work out what's going on with the vowels. And so I kind of did a semi-automated method when I was counting the correspondences between the orthography and the phonemes, because the Nanticoke word lists are just long enough where if you go through and try to manually count things, you're going to lose your place and get frustrated. They're not long enough where you could use like any automated methods where, there's not enough data there for any sort of algorithm to automatically work out what the correspondences are. And so I give an example here of my methodology. So I take the word for light, wasakwateu, and we have here this PA, that's abbreviation for Proto-Algonquian. So that's the Proto-Algonquian etymology. What I did was, on the left-hand side, I would have this Proto-Algonquian etymology, and I would separate it into its constituent phonemes. And so that would, consonants, vowels, but also consonant clusters. That's an important part of Algonquian historical phonology. And not to get into too much detail, but this is really kind of a relic of a very early stage of the language where you had like 2 morphemes coming together in a certain way. And so like this third phoneme here, this glottal stop S, the Proto-Algonquian didn't license place contrasts to place of articulation. So where you have that glottal stop there, it could be originally have been like a P, a T, a K, etc. The stop consonants would be debuccalized, as we say, and become a glottal stop. So with that underlying, you'll see in a lot of other words for light, like the word white, wapeu, dawn, or the word Nanticoke word for east is the direction of dawn, wapaneu. You can see that it was probably originally a P there. But at any rate, I would take this Proto-Algonquian etymology and separate it into its constituent phonemes, have this little pipe character here to separate it. And I would transcribe, I would copy over the chop tank or the Nanticoke orthography on the right side here and separate that out into the letters that, as I thought they corresponded to the proto-language phonemes. The end here, I had this PEADEL. That's a tag that I used. The Proto-Eastern Algonquian, it had the regular pattern of vowel loss. So that's how I tallied up the number of times that occurred in the vocabularies. So I wrote up a Python script to calculate it. It would split the etymology and the orthography at that pipe character there, and then just kind of zip together all of the Proto-Algonquian and Proto-Eastern Algonquian phonemes to the orthographic segments, and then just do a tally of how many times that correspondence occurred. And since phonemes, there's a lot of like vowel coloring that can occur depending upon what it's next to. After I did this raw count of all of the phoneme to orthography correspondences, I did more qualitative analysis and just kind of looked back to see where these certain segments, like in which context would these segments occur to refine it further. So these are examples from the Murray word list, and you can see here that there's some divergence with with the way that we have different interpretations in Brenton and Speck about what the words actually were, going back to just the really, I mean, quill pen writing is just plain difficult, even setting aside things like the different language orthography conventions and all. So we can see in Speck, the word for moon, he recorded as Amkonihunk. And this actually made it into Dr. Pentland's dissertation. Back in 1979, the internet wasn't, it's like I could find a lot of these manuscripts just right at my fingertips. But then, Dr. Pentland would have had to schlep from Canada all the way to Philadelphia to look at the original. So he can be forgiven, for citing Speck, but you can see that some of these miscopyings did have some downstream effects when it came to phonological analysis. So in my fresh transcription, I saw that it was Konihunk, which actually agreed with Brenton's interpretation. But this is a really interesting word here. What moon actually means here. So we have, this is not to get too technical, it's called a conjunct participle, but this stem here, tukku, means night. And what this literally depicting here is, so it's an idea among a lot of Algonquian cultures that the luminaries, like the sun, the moon, are guided by the spirit of that luminary. So the moon literally means that which, the spirit moves by hand to make night. So when we go into these etymologies, we can unlock some really fascinating clues about the culture. We have the word basket. Brenton recorded that as something like manole. Actually probably more manot, which is very, that's pretty much how it appears in cognate terms. Meshakwapanu, summer, that means when the light is great. But you can see that it's difficult to distinguish an N and a U sometimes. Then we have the numeral 10, mila, in Brenton. It's actually mita. And it's just a very faint crossbar across the T's that Brenton missed there. And then we had this waskagu in Brenton, which is actually oskayu, or sorry, oskeu. And that eu is pretty much what you would expect for this inanimate and transitive verb ending there. But I think the word list where it was most important to go back to the originals was Jefferson. So Brenton didn't copy the Jefferson list, only Speck did a copy, but he actually missed an entire line and accidentally recorded a line of Shawnee into the vocabulary. That made it into Dr. Pentland's phonological analysis in '79, and actually was not corrected as of the recent dictionary published. Dr. Pentland absolutely did mean to go back to the original manuscripts. Regrettably, did not get time to do so. Before his passing. But going back to the original manuscripts, you can see that the rows kind of sit a little lower on the page than they do on the other pages. And since the manuscript's water damaged, you're missing some of the labels for the rows and columns. So you have to go back and count in order to find what the correct Nanticoke line is. And, once I found the correct line here, we can see that the words for the seasons here and the word for man are actually a lot closer to what, so the words for the seasons are what you find, they're very close to what you find on the Murray manuscript, and then Nop for man, that's what you would find on Heckewelder. So just going back to the original manuscripts reduced a lot of the perception that that this was a really divergent dialect, because these on the left here were actually Shawnee words. Then we have some examples from Heckewelder. And I mentioned before that this was recorded, I think probably Samuel Nanticoke. And so it exhibits a lot of influence from Delaware and Ojibwe. It makes sense that being that the Moravian mission was largely Lenape, that a lot of the liturgical terms would derive from it. But it looks like we also have some Ojibwe ones as well. You know, Gichi Manitou, meaning great spirit, the word for creator. If it were Nanticoke, we'd probably expect it Manit versus Manitou that would have this tendency in Nanticoke to drop a lot of word endings. And we actually have some we have some variants here where we can see that there's an Nanticoke term coupled with a term from one of the other Algonquian languages. And we have the word for heaven, Ishpumink, which is probably taken from Ojibwe. And then we have a spumant, which is more what we expect from Nanticoke. And a good clue for this is looking at the ending here. That suffix there is called a locative. And you'll notice in Maryland place names, such as like Patuxent, Sinnapuxent, etc., the locative has a T ending in Maryland Algonquian. Whereas, that can, in a lot of place names, like Lenape place names, it'll be like a K or, it's the ing ending. And often in Ojibwe as well. And we have creator Kishelomukwang. This looks very much to be a Delaware term. And so, as I mentioned before, like just going back to the original word lists, especially for Jefferson, eliminated a lot of the variants. But we do have some. These are the words here where we have the same English head word, but it's represented differently in across the manuscripts. And we can see in general that the Jefferson manuscript agrees it follows the Heckewelder one very closely, albeit the orthography is quite different. But then in one instance, Koshkop, it looks like it favors the Murray orthography. This is just here. This is the areas of, you can just kind of see that where some of the vocabulary can differ somewhat among the word lists, but probably it was not really a great barrier to mutual intelligibility. So going to the findings, doing both the raw counts and then going back and looking at the context in which the orthography segments appeared, I found that largely, the Nanticoke phonology agrees with the 6-vowel system of Proto-Eastern Algonquian. And there's this interesting phenomenon that I found that only occurs in Nanticoke, where the eh is dropped in the ultima. And I think this is by analogy. The terminal, the Nanticoke has this tendency to drop the final syllables. And I think that in the it kind of by analogy, the dropping of the a occurred also in places where it wouldn't ordinarily, like conjunct verbs, etc. I did find multiple reflexes of the Proto-Eastern Algonquian R, and that's kind of become like a shorthand way of referring to different dialects. Like you have L dialect, Y dialect, but it's actually not uncommon to find these multiple reflexes even in languages that were not as where there's not nearly as much coalescence of a lot of different groups together. But we found evidence of L, this kind of lateral alveolar fricative, Y, and then sometimes N and T as a reflex of this Proto-Eastern Algonquian R. And I think they were all likely part of the same general kind of language group, but these were probably relics of the different dialects that were spoken in Maryland. And so we have a lot of evidence of Delaware and Ojibwe in Murray and in the Murray and Heckewelder lists, showing that there was a lot of contact with other Algonquian groups. So once I looked at the individual word lists, I put it all, I wanted to put it all together to get a composite look at the phonology of Nanticoke. And I found reflexes of a good number of the Proto-Algonquian consonant clusters. Interestingly, so I noted here this the reflex of HR, the asterisk after it. So Dr. Pentland, his posthumous dictionary, he actually did find, and I wasn't able to find a reflex of that. He did in the word for heart in the Heckewelder list, and it confirmed my guess about what the reflex would be, even though I didn't find that particular etymology for it. You can see there are like some question marks here where they're about, that's where you know, we have 7 clusters that are unattested. If we look at it in the context of Proto-Eastern Algonquian, there are less clusters to really account for. Ives Goddard said that the pre-glottalized consonant cluster series converged with the, you know, the pre-aspirated ones. So that fills in some of the gaps here. We don't have, you know, HP attested here, but this row is pretty well accounted for. Also, some of these consonant clusters are contested, so we may not have to worry about them too much. For instance, this row, the 3rd row here, really there's only good evidence for it in Menominee. It may be actually reflecting something internal to Menominee, and not, these might not actually be Proto-Algonquian clusters. And then ST is found in exactly one etymology, which is the source of, like, for instance, the Ojibwe word Oshtigwan. For, you know, language revitalization purposes, we already have the word for head in Nanticoke is wish, from a different, you know, wishahum. It comes from a different etymology. We don't really, given that this is attested exactly once, or given that it's reconstructed in exactly one etymology, it's not really that great of a loss that we don't know what the reflex is. Presumably it would be you know, ST and Nanticoke if it existed. And once I had the evidence for Nanticoke, I appealed to the rest of the Eastern Algonquian subgroup to kind of fill in the gaps a little bit further. And a part of this entailed me going back and kind of ironing out some discrepancies in some earlier work. A lot of works on the Eastern Algonquian daughter languages were written before Ives Goddard's idea of Eastern Algonquian as a genetic subgroup was really well established. Or rather, before there was a really large consensus regarding it. And in a lot of cases, I went back to where there were some conflicting things, especially like the word for flint has a lot of really odd reflexes. But then if you look at its form as a medial, it has an expected reflex. So I went back and cleaned up a lot of these correspondences in the daughter languages based on, you know, going back to you know, cognates in those languages. And so we can see this is the pre-glottalized consonant cluster series in Eastern Algonquian, which I mentioned before merges together with the pre-aspirated consonant clusters. And you can see this is very well attested throughout the family, or through the subgroup. And then, so the pre-aspirated one, a little less so. In these instances where I have these asterisks here, either well, in Nanticoke it was either, you know, tentative, or we just don't have a reflex at all. But we can kind of, using the evidence from the glottal series, we can infer a lot of times what the missing reflex would be. And so we had this missing reflex HP for Nanticoke, and actually in Piscataway it is attested. So, you know, the this one, the 3rd column here, you know, this is from that word Kichimanatu, which might be a loan word. So it's not really, you know, it's not really certain that that is an Nanticoke word, but looking at its reflex in the rest of the daughter languages, it's reasonable to guess that that would be the correct reflex. So then we have the nasal consonant cluster series. That's we have this is where things get a little tricky. You know, the word for flint is the N theta consonant cluster. That wasn't attested, but you know, using evidence from the other daughter languages, we can guess at what it would be, because these the mergers that occur across the Eastern Algonquian subgroup, we can guess even in instances where it's not attested that it would follow the same pattern. And then so finally we had this consonant cluster series is really well attested in Nanticoke. Didn't have to do too much, you know, comparative work there. And then, and once I had all that information, this was when I was writing this turned out to be chapter 7 of my dissertation, and right around the time that I was writing it was when ChatGPT really started becoming popular. And so I was just really I was just kind of curious to see what it does. And I was hoping to see, I just started experimenting with it. And what wasn't originally part of my plan for that chapter, but I wanted to see how it could kind of simplify the process of doing some of this phonological analysis. So I asked it a series of questions about ways that I could kind of quantitatively determine how closely related the languages were, and wound up with over 20 different Python scripts that it gave me. And so an important takeaway here is, with AI, it's like, sometimes it generates garbage. A good number of the scripts didn't work right out of the box. They required some tweaking. Others provide some rather strange results. So, the lesson is, it's very useful, and it would have taken me a few months to do maybe a few weeks to do the scripts that worked. But it's like it's useful for generating, for saving time, but you still have to know enough to interpret it correctly, because sometimes it can very confidently provide you with some bad results. But after I got this, after I had played around with these 20 plus scripts and realized that I'm never going to be able to fit this in one chapter, I just selected a representative 5 scripts that I thought provided the most interesting results. And I'll tell you the details of 2 of them today. And I basically took that information that I showed to you in the previous section with all the consonant clusters, and I combined that with a lot of the diagnostic factors that Ives Goddard used in his 1978 work on Eastern Algonquian for kind of grouping these Eastern Algonquian languages into subgroups. And I also took some data from Siebert 1975, his work on Virginia Algonquian as well. And I gave the table to ChatGPT, and then it generated the scripts based on that. But I ran the scripts offline so that it wouldn't generate hallucinations of the data. So one thing I did was Jacquard similarity. It's basically counting up how many unique items there are, and then in between the different groups, you're seeing how many items they have in common there, and then assigning the score like 0 to 1. The closer to 1 you get, the more the closer that the groups are. And so with that, I generated a heat map, and we can kind of see this is so for each of these scripts, first I would run it using only attested data, and then I would use the predicted values next. And I did that just kind of make sure that I wasn't overly influencing the results, and also to assess like how robust these methods were in instances where they didn't have complete data. And this is just with the attested data alone, we get an interesting picture of some of the subgroups or some of the groupings within Eastern Algonquian. You can see, Mi'kmaq is kind of the most divergent. It has some clear, we can see it has clear phonological affinities with the Benaki, but there is a distinct non-Algonquian component that makes it a little bit different from the rest of the Eastern group. You can see the Benaki languages cluster very closely together. The heat map here, you can see that the Western Abenaki, Passamaquoddy, Penobscot have a close affinity. Nipmuc, this reaffirms that Nipmuc is kind of this transitional language between the Southern New England group and the Abenaki group. And then, of course, we have Southern New England Algonquian down here represented in Massachusetts, Narragansett, Wampanoag. And then we have this Delawarean subgroup, this medial division that, had stayed in the Midwest for some time and eventually moved to the Eastern Seaboard. Phonologically, this Delawarean group is more conservative than the rest of the Eastern Algonquian languages. And you can see they cluster you can see that they have very close affinities for one another. And then you have Nanticoke and Virginia Algonquian, and you can see they cluster together. Then I added in the predicted data, and you can see it's same general picture, but it's just a little, it adds a little bit more definition to it. Then I used UPGMA. This is kind of like it's calculating the that's unweighted pair group method with arithmetic mean. It is grouping together similar items and kind of iterating through. And based on the similarities, it's kind of grouping it. It calculates the similarity and then groups similar items together, and then iteratively kind of creates this tree. And the advantage of this for trying to map out languages is that I can establish Proto-Eastern Algonquian as kind of the root of this tree, and then see how the other languages kind of fan out from it. And just with the attested data, again, we can see that the Delawarean group, this Mohican, Munsee, Unami, they comprise one group, and you can see that Munsee and Unami are more closely related. The position of Mi'kmaq is interesting here, but it could reflect like kind of an early split. I would expect it to cluster more closely with the New England Algonquian languages, though. Then again, you see Nanticoke and Virginia Algonquian kind of fan off here. They're they share a rung of this tree. Then the Abenaki languages, and then Southern New England Algonquian. Then when you add in the predicted values, it largely stays the same, but then you see that Mi'kmaq shifts over here, and it seems to have more of an affinity with the New England Algonquian languages. So you can see this method isn't quite as robust against having missing data, but it does provide a very elegant picture when I do fill in the blanks. So putting it all together, I found that the really important division in Eastern Algonquian here is whether or not Esh merges with S. Initially, when I was going in, I sort of being heavily influenced by work such as Siebert 1975, positing like this archaic coastal group. I had thought maybe that I was kind of had the hypothesis that Nanticoke and Powhatan were part of this continuous dialect line with Southern New England Algonquian that was split by this medial group. But it seems like a lot of the similarities between Nanticoke and Southern New England Algonquian might be kind of fostered by the close contact that they had. I think that on a deeper level, we can see by these the phoneme distinctions that it looks like Nanticoke and Powhatan they're more conservative than the Southern New England Algonquian languages with regards to the reflex of Esh. Delawarean preserves it, but the Esh becomes more of this velar fricative, which kind of it's phonetically it's an innovation, but phonologically these languages are quite conservative. And so we can see that in Nanticoke, the singleton Esh will sometimes merge with S, but it remains distinct word initially. And but it is preserved in consonant clusters, whereas in there is an Esh in New England Algonquian, but it's actually it's an innovation. It's a chain shift whereby Southern New England first lost the distinction between Esh and S, but then there were new instances of Esh that emerged in these consonant clusters from HR and HX there. So this I think that the story this is going back to like the oral tradition and all this seems it seems to reflect it seems to reflect the route that was documented in oral tradition, archaeology, etc., where it seems like Nanticoke and Powhatan split from this Delawarean split from the Lenape, while they were still in the Midwest. And a lot of these contact traits that Nanticoke shares with Southern New England Algonquian include that loss of those final syllables that I mentioned before. But it looks like Powhatan doesn't do it as much, so I think it might be more of a language contact feature versus something, a genetic feature of that language group per se. And then once the Delawarean group, once the Lenape, once they migrated eastward and a number of them joined the Nanticoke, you have this renewed interaction that leaves a lot of shows a lot of traces in Nanticoke, but also throughout the Southeast in general, or all the way down to North Carolina. So with this information, this informed my pedagogical reconstruction. When we're filling it, we have a lot of blanks in the morphology, but then with the evidence from the phonological analysis, filling in the blanks, we can kind of make some informed guesses about what they would have been. And so I appealed to Munsee Delaware, which is the most conservative Eastern Algonquian language, a lot of cases. But then it's like, since there is that contact feature between Nanticoke and Massachusetts where the word endings are lost a lot of times, when that occurs in Massachusetts, I would predict that that same phenomenon would occur in the Nanticoke instances. But then, of course, I would have to undo a lot of things, like we don't have that intrusive nasal for the long A in Nanticoke. So when I'm appealing to the sources, I'm kind of undoing the changes that occur in the daughter languages and then, reconstructing forwards from what the proto language version would be. And with that, I honed in on because Algonquian morphology would be basically a whole dissertation unto itself. So I focused on the forms I thought would be most useful for learners. And first I started with first I tried to make a practical orthography that accounted for a lot of language variation. A lot of times, there's a case where if you choose a standard version, that's at the expense of any other variants. But I thought I'd give learners a little bit of freedom, and I experimented with, for instance, writing the reflex of Proto-Algonquian R as a double L. So it could be L like in English, or Y like in Spanish, or even that lateral alveolar fricative, similar to like the Welsh double L there. And so one of the things that David Pentland mentioned in his dissertation was that it's with variation, we can't really reconstruct a normal syncope pattern, but this kind of variation occurs even in better documented languages and ones that are still living. So it's like we can take a page from the Wampanoag language of reclamation, and in these pedagogical resources, we can make this syncope optional. Let learners choose whether they want to say kisuku or kisku. And as far as the most useful grammatical patterns, Connor Quinn was on my committee, and he developed the minimal course, which is a series of lessonlets that so as I mentioned, when my initial classes for the community, it was very heavy with like grammar terminology and all, and that can tend to overwhelm learners. The minimal course does away with arcane grammatical terminology and teaches these patterns just through a series of example sentences. And the lessonlets, they loop back and incorporate elements of earlier lessonlets that kind of reinforce the memorization of the patterns that are introduced in them. And so this was, Connor developed this for Penobscot. It's since been used for Passamaquoddy, Long Island, Algonquian. And so I basically, for my last chapter of my dissertation, adapted it to Nanticoke. And so this is some example of how why this works out well. We have, I think I mentioned before that their noun gender, you have animate and inanimate in Algonquian, which is an old, actually, excuse me, that, it's a noun, animacy. One moment, please. But, verbs and particles, they'll also show that agreement. But, so anything that's physically animate, people, animals will be an animate noun. And then inanimate nouns include things like certain plants, geographic features. However, you get all these exceptions. You'll have tobacco pipes are animate, ceremonial items, some large trees, etc. So we can see that it's not really what's being, and this distinction isn't really truly animate, inanimate. And if we teach this in that way, we can get, and then just like teach a bunch of exceptions, that has the potential to confuse learners. So instead, we can do it by example. So the interrogative for any animate noun, use awen. So awen hana, who is that? Kwek hana, what is that? And then in these example sentences, so you have awen, the interrogative, kwek, for the interrogative for inanimate. You also have the demonstrative, na and ne, the distinction there between animate and inanimate. And so then there's another lessonlet here introducing noun possession and pronouns. You have ki ha nakik. So is that your mother? Ame ni na nik. And you can see that this question and answer, you're taking the same template here and just swapping, you have the question is in second person and then the answer is in first person there. And it's just implicitly through these examples that learners will learn the difference between the forms. And you can see I highlighted it there to show the differences. So let's try it out, actually. So we have a question here, Kiha nakitap ame, and maybe see if we can put in the chat there what the answer should be. Okay, no worries. I won't put you all on the spot. Here you go. Ame ni na ni tap. Yes, that is my friend. Now, when I was off doing my dissertation, I actually, this is a community effort. I'm not the only one doing this kind of work. I'm very very blessed to be working with some really talented people within the tribe as well, including Raggy Rain, the storyteller for the tribe, Carell Hall, who is also, she's working on her PhD in Nanticoke as well. And so some community efforts to reintroduce the language and kind of increase visibility for it included a playground in Laurel, Delaware. The Laurel's near the Nanticoke River, so that's the traditional territory there. And this playground contains the equipment is all emblematic of these 4 animals that are that figure in traditional Nanticoke stories. And so here we have tribal members, Herman Jackson, Mike Harmon here, dedicating the playground. And this is this beaver here is alluding to the story how Beaver got his tail. And there are QR codes on the equipment too that you can scan and get the story and the names in Nanticoke for these animals. Then really no amount of intellect and research can bring a language back by itself. We need to create a speaker base. And so really the textbook that I created in collaboration with the tribe is the first step in bringing making some pedagogical resources for the community. And this was mostly written during 2021. So it was during the height of the pandemic and the quarantine. And we were basically making the best of a very uncertain time. And, doing so with the faith that, that we would persevere and that the actions that the work we were doing would result in the language being brought back for 7 generations and beyond. So we all brought a lot of this harmonizes a lot of earlier pedagogical work. I had some examples from my YouTube videos, which I updated based on my what I had found in my dissertation work. Raggy has been teaching children Nanticoke words for a while, and she incorporated some of her best practices and what she's found effective with the young learners. And Carell is studying the Munsee language, very closely related, and she incorporated a lot of what she found effective from those classes into these materials. And it's accompanied by a CD, which in addition to with the pronunciations of the vocabulary, we even have the tribal musical group Red Blanket created a song. They added music for the song that Raggy thought up, and I translated, that we have at the end of the book there. And then also, I have to mention, it was beautiful. The book was beautifully illustrated by Paige McNatt, our artist, and we had a lot of wonderful photographs from Pastor Fred, and then we were working with Reverend Jennifer Kirby of the Methodist Church, who proofread our work and gave it the professional touch, getting it to its published version. But so our next steps, we already have in the works some ideas for a storybook. These will be the 4 stories that were represented at the playground, and we're going to actually have them translated into Nanticoke. Going to have some more in-person classes, more textbooks, an online dictionary that will make the language widely available. And finally, mentoring Nanticoke language warriors. As I'm not Nanticoke myself, and I think that outsiders can and do make wonderful contributions to language revitalization. But I think importantly, in order to keep the language going for 7 generations, we must empower the tribes themselves to to foster this language work, ensure that it continues onward. And with that, that's the end of my presentation, and I'd like to open the floor for any questions that you might have.
So I think to start with, Greg had a couple of questions in the chat. Greg, do you want to go ahead and ask your questions?
Oh, there are quite a few questions there. Okay. Oh, sorry. Please continue, Greg.
Keith,
Mhm.
I was just curious, are there any common English words that have come from Nanticoke that you know of?
A lot of them have come from Virginia Algonquian. One word that I think that I'm fairly certain came from Nanticoke, although it's a bit archaic, is monox, groundhog. And the reason I think it's from Nanticoke, so the derivation of it, mon is to dig, ach is earth, but then the agentive suffix there, like if you would expect monachis or monachs, but then that loss of that e there, I think is a very characteristic Nanticoke feature. So I think the word monax, which is actually still part of the scientific nomenclature for the groundhog, derives from Nanticoke.
Really?
Mhm. And
Okay.
when I was mentioning the sources, I also, I just, I think I briefly mentioned in passing about place names. We do, there are lots of place names preserved for posterity. Unfortunately, they provide no shortage of difficulties for interpretation. It helps. I mean, if we don't already have some sort of indication of what the place name meant, it's very hard to kind of tease out, especially even if we can go back to the earliest attested spellings, what is the underlying Algonquian form of that? But sometimes we can get a good idea of them, and they provide some useful information as well. So yeah, cards.
No, thank you. The other question I had, and this just jumped into my head, that Mahican, is that what we know as Mohican?
Mm-hmm.
Are they one and the same?
There's there's Mohegan and Mohican, related but distinct.
Okay,
The
so they're not the same.
Mhm.
All right. Well,
Mohegan, that's
thank you.
oh, you're welcome. Yeah, Mohegan, that's the Connecticut, Southern New England Algonquian speakers. Mohican, they're part of the Delawarean, they're like the Delawarean subgroup, and they're also part of Connecticut as well, but like upstate New York and thereabouts. So both Algonquian, but different groups, also different etymologies. Mohegan, I think, means wolf. And Mohican, I've heard different interpretations. Some say like is it like the river that's always moving or something like that. I can't verify, I have to go back and verify what the etymology is. But yeah, related but different, basically. Okay, let's see. Nanticoke words used in cultural practices. If there are any, so even I think by the time that Frank Speck visited the community, there wasn't a trace of the language left. Although I've seen in some sources that maybe the word for oyster, kolche, had survived for some time. But by the 20th century, uh, there weren't any words that survived to be documented, at least as far as anyone knows.
There
Okay.
was one about Nanticoke words borrowed into English. I guess did Greg?
Oh yeah, I think Monax is the one that off the top of my head that I can think of, and really Virginia Algonquian, which is closely related but still a different different language, contributes a lot more, like moccasin, raccoon, etc.
Yeah, I have another one, Keith. Given I mean, Maryland, the Delaware, I know Delaware had, some Swedish influence in the early settlers.
Mhm.
Is there any is there any European language influence on Nanticoke that you know of? Not
Uh,
just Nanticoke per se.
Mentioning Swedish, definitely on Lenape. For instance, like the there's some Swedish influence on Unami, Delaware. Actually, the word for chicken, tipas, like tip is a call that apparently the Swedish is common among Swedish people for gathering their chickens together, and then os is a common suffix in bird names. I can't think of there's some Dutch words as well that have made their way into the Delawarean languages. Kind of blanking at the moment. I'll probably think of them later and I'll email you when I remember them.
And Freddie had a comment.
Mhm.
Freddie, do you want to comment about Quinn's approach?
Yeah, excuse me, my dog may be barking in the background here, but I was really interested in the pedagogy that you mentioned by Quinn of using the language itself rather than going into all the grammatical terms. I mean, I think that's really helpful and avoids a lot of dissatisfaction, so you might say. So I
Mhm.
appreciate that, and the way you illustrated that too with how you were approaching it is really good. Appreciate that.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, that was yeah, I definitely especially going into my first foray into teaching, I was definitely looking at the language from the perspective of a linguist. As a linguist, I think, setting things out and, kind of analyzing things with all these grammatical terms helps me. But then I think, definitely adapting it to non-linguist audiences and teaching the language, rather kind of doing this meta teaching where you're kind of dissecting it and classifying all the words into different things. Seems it's a lot more effective and a lot less intimidating. So I was very honored to get a chance to work with Connor for that aspect of the language. So date set for the future class, not to be determined, but definitely not in the too different. Sorry, not in the too distant future. I'm going to check in with my I'm going to check in with Raggy and Carell and see. So Carell's still working on her dissertation. I don't want to intrude upon that too much because she's very busy. But I'm hoping maybe sometimes toward the end of this year that I will start teaching. Certainly, I'm hoping very, very soon to get back to my online lessons, at the very least. But I'll get back to you when I have some more details about specifics when the classes are. An online dictionary is going to be something after Carell's finished with her her dissertation. Elaborate a bit on the benefits and pitfalls of AI. Oh, certainly. Yeah, the benefit of using AI tools is definitely it's a time saver. For a lot of the scripts that I used for my dissertation, these are things that I could code on my own. For one of my Python classes, I did a mini phylogeny using things like Levenstein, edit distance, and all. But it would take some time for me to kind of code that myself and run all of those things. And of course, the pitfall is that AI hallucinates, as they say. It'll generate false answers, and it'll do so very confidently. So it's very easy to mislead somebody who doesn't already have some expertise in whatever they're trying to use AI to assist them. Are there any issues that are? Oh, wow, the questions are coming quickly. Let's see. Scroll back to.
Actually,
Okay.
I think Mark had one earlier about orthography.
Oh, yeah, issues with non-English sounds when developing. Yeah, that. So Ives Goddard pointed out that whole lateral alveolar fricative thing, where Murray would write that like oftentimes a double L or an L, but with like an exclamation point after it, which he uses for kind of an aspiration. That sound is probably Algonquian languages, for all of their morphological complexity, phonologic, the phonetics of it are generally fairly easy to grasp. But that's one, that was one sound that's kind of very foreign to an English speaker, and but that's kind of why I favor the that kind of double L to, and then let learners decide whether they want to pronounce it. They say probably easier in a word, like if it's the word for arrow, like if they want to say achlons or allons or ayons, that'll kind of give them the flexibility to pronounce it whichever dialect they want to emulate. Okay, issues when I approached the Nanticoke tribe. Not really, it's like it all started very informally. I just kind of went to the museum and I struck up a conversation with Sterling, and it just so happened, I mean, with Myra Lynn Ranville's instructions to seek out a linguist to work on, trying to figure out what were the distinct, kind of reworking the morphology, from a linguistic perspective. I didn't really encounter any sort of issues with working with the tribe. It looks like they were already wanting somebody to do this kind of work. After the Winnesaukee incident, majority, oh, right. So, there were just I mentioned the Chop Tank Reservation, which just had like a handful of individuals. There was Indian River. So the Nanticoke community is now at Indian River, Delaware. Then it was part of Maryland, but there's Uskexy Reservation there, and that was included what were originally called Indian River Indians, Nanticoke, and also Assateague. There was let's see, Asquiminoconsin, that I think that's Snow Hill. Literally means where they pick the unripe berries. That was one of the towns set aside. Excuse me. And then there was a Chicon reservation. And well, with regards to legal status, after the reservations were dissolved, anybody who remained would usually, it would be at the cost of their identity. They would be reclassified in the censuses as free people of color, and of course that makes that confounds trying to document Indian ancestry in a lot of ways. Yeah, so that sort of thing, and then, in terms of isolation, you'll find across the Eastern Seaboard, a lot of the remnant groups, they will be in kind of far-flung areas of the state that'll kind of insulate them from kind of, allow them to kind of, the relative isolation will, in a way, help them to preserve their identity. Okay.
Looks like that's about it. Thank you so much. Oops, there's another.
Oh, Assateague, indeed. Yep, that's where it derives its name from. Excellent.
And on behalf of the National Museum of Language, definitely want to thank you, Keith, for sharing your work with us and the detail involved, and the amount of technology you used in your analysis. And it's really an impressive piece of research. You certainly deserved your doctorate's degree that you were granted for this.
Thank you.
It's emblematic of showing the importance of attacking scholars attacking issues which have been neglected. And I think this is what you're doing here. It's not just the language, but this is an important part of, say, Maryland and Delaware history that hasn't been taught to modern day residents of the states here. So yeah, I just want to thank you so much for coming out today to share your information with us. It was really, really interesting and very well presented.
Thank you. I'm very honored to be invited to speak. And everyone, let's say, Wanishiyeli Pandai. Thank you for listening to me.